This is Pod Populi.
Podcast for the people.
The Great Love Debate. It's the Great Love Debate.
The Great Love Debate. It's the Great Love Debate.
Hi again, everyone. It's Brian Howie. Welcome to the Great Love Debate, the world's number one dating and relationship podcast. Since 2015, I'm here in the very fine studios of Pod Populi, podcast for the people. I'm at the brand new one in Vegas. It's a little echoey. It's not quite complete, but it's getting there. Pod Populi Vegas. Check it out when you're doing bad things in Vegas. So let me tell you a story from my strange and estranged mother that will pretty much sum up her, a little bit of why I am the way I am, and will also lead into what I want to get into today. So bear with me. It is all going to make sense. Amateur shrinks who are listening to this, I eagerly anticipate your analysis. So anyway, my grandmother, my mother's mother, who I was very close to, she died some years ago. And my mother, never one for pomp and circumstance and ceremony, she quickly threw together this half-assed memorial service for my grandmother in the town where my grandmother lived for 90 years and had a lot of friends who wanted to pay tribute to or mourn her passing. And there was this brief thrown together graveside ceremony that was preceded by my mother pronouncing, "Let's get this show on the road," while what remained of my grandmother's octogenarian posse tried to make it across an ice-covered November cemetery to make it on time. Anyway, after all that was done, I said to my mother, "Did anyone write an obituary for Grandma?" And my mother kind of blew off the idea. She said it didn't matter. Most everyone knew her is dead anyway, she said. And I said, well, she worked at the city's newspaper for many years, so it would be easy enough to submit, and we could send it in, and I'm sure they would print it, and maybe some of her colleagues at the paper would think it's nice to see some thoughts on her. So my mother said, fine. And a few days later, I'm back home in California, and my sister sends me a link to the obituary that ran in the paper. And it said, she is survived by her daughter, my mother, and her 3 grandchildren, my 2 sisters, and also Brian in Santa Barbara. So I called my mother and I said, hey, I appreciate the obituary, but I don't live in Santa Barbara. I live in Santa Monica. And after a 5-second pause, my mother responded, who cares, really? And that always stuck with me. The way she said it, how dismissive she was of me and the moment and my grandmother, all of it. It was just, who cares, really? And I thought, and I often have thought about that, and I thought, what an awful thing to say and feel. And so you're probably wondering, well, why am I bringing all this up now? And what does it have to do with love and dating and relationships and what I want to talk about today? Well, last month at one of our live shows, afterwards, this guy comes up to me and says, what should I do if most women will dismiss any chance I have of asking them out because of my height? And I said to him, how tall are you? Because he really didn't seem all that short. He was maybe a couple inches shorter than me, and I'm not that short. And he says 5'9". And in that moment, for the first time, I took my mother's heartless, dismissive words and I used them as my own. Who cares, really? So for years on this show, Great Love Debate, and episode after episode, I've come to the defense of the shorter men. I really have always thought it was ridiculous that the women were going to rule out a whole lot of possibly really good guys because of that one physical characteristic. And I have always been extra sympathetic to it because I was one of those guys in high school. I was like 5'4", 5'5" until my senior year, and I grew to be 6 feet. But I definitely stared into the abyss for a whole lot of it, a whole lot of my adolescence. So the guys, you've heard me come to your defense a million times. The guys who are under, 5'10". But after crunching some numbers and really diving into this again and hearing that guy say it to me in that moment, I'm going to say it to you guys. Who cares, really? And so you're wondering why I had this change of heart. And before you say, it's easy for you to say, I'm going to explain all of it. I'm going to explain the logic. I'm going to explain some stats. And I'm going to explain why I sort of boomeranged on this thing in detail. And my logic will amaze and astound you. And we'll get into all of it right after this. And we are back. So you're probably like, why the 180 on the heights thing? So let me start by approaching the ridiculous woman side of things. And again, we've given you these stats before. So when I ask the women at our shows, do you know how many men are actually 6 feet or taller? And the answer I always get is something like half. And I have to tell them, no, it's 14%. It's fewer than 1 out of 7. And do you know how many are 6'2" or taller? 6.8%. 1 out of every 16-ish guys is 6'2" or taller. So the women, you are ruling out at least 85% of the dating pool before you get into any other characteristics that you may or may not like. And plus, those rare 6'2 plus dudes, the tall guys, they like feeling tall. So they pretty much rule out any woman over 5'7" because when she's in heels, trust me, she's always in heels, he no longer feels that tall anymore. And the best part of being tall is feeling tall. So it's ridiculous and it really kills a woman's odds. But I've fought this battle for 10 years. So guys, average guys, little guys, short fellas, she's not changing her mind. So you got to let it go. And you got to let her go. Because the ones that think that way, they like what they like, and they're going to learn the hard way when the odds suddenly come back to haunt them, that their warped perception is not reality, and it doesn't have to be your reality. But here's why that guy at that show triggered me. Because he made it his reality. He said he's 5'9". 5'9" is average. And while you're not going to convince a lot of women that you're, an NBA power forward, it's probably imperceptible to most women as it was to me. I couldn't tell if he was 5'8", 5'10", 5'11". I really couldn't tell. He just seemed normal. But he continued with his complaining. And he went on. He goes, if I put 5'11" on my dating profile, the women are going to think I'm 5'9". And if I put I'm 5'9", they're going to think I'm 5'7". So I get penalized for being honest. And by this time, there's like a little crowd forming around me for this conversation. And I said, that's all true. Everything you just said is true. If you put that you are 5'9", she's probably going to think, oh, well, he didn't lie the other way. He must be lying this way. He's probably 5'7", which sucks. Sucks. But I think this isn't about the number. This is about how you own your perception of yourself. So let's say a huge chunk of women care negatively about you being 5'7" or whatever. And let's say it's an overwhelming majority. Let's say it's 80% of women who are exclusively chasing tall guys. That leaves 20% of the women who don't care about the height. And that 20% of the women who don't care about the height is a bigger number than the percentage of guys who are as tall as the rest of them want to chase. And 20% of women is a shit ton of women. So you got to go after them. And you got to convince them that besides your height issue or non-issues, that you have every other thing that they could want. And suddenly the height thing goes down the ladder in terms of characteristics. And some of the guys I know who got the most chicks back in the day, and sorry if you're offended by the word chicks, you're probably not the audience for this, but they were cocky, ballsy, 5'6" fuckers. And I know you know that most of your favorite actors are short. You know, Lenny Kravitz, you don't think he gets some girls? He's 5'8". Prince was 5'2". Every single Rolling Stone is under 5'9". And you're probably like, oh, those are old man references. Justin Bieber's 5'9". Bruno Mars is 5'5". Jack Black is 5'6" and fat. He married a model. And all those guys, you know, the reason they have what they have is they don't give a fuck. And if they did give a fuck, the minute they stopped giving a fuck and focus on other things was probably the minute that the women began to focus on other things too. And there's plenty of really tall women who do not care one bit about the guy's height because they tower over the tall guys too. You know, and you could work hard and stand on your wallet and you can at least symbolically match her height. So go out and make your fortune and then get back to me on all of this. Get back to me how big a handicap this really is, or if it's a big handicap because you're making it one. So this woman came to our show in Los Angeles a few years ago, and she said her husband was 5'5", her ex-husband. And she was beautiful. And another woman at the show gasped, and she said, how did that happen? And she answered, by the time I saw him standing up, I was already in love with him. Because that guy probably had some game. So what I'm getting at here is you got to stop whining about what you can't change, just like she's got to stop judging you on what you can't change. And you have to be the biggest, ballsiest guy in the room, or at least feel that way about yourself. And she'll notice that. It'll make you seem, giant in her eyes. So and the women complain, oh, the guys lie about it. Are there a lot of guys who fudge the height on their profiles to get the job interview, so to speak? They sure do. And do I blame them? Not entirely, but my issue, if you're one of those guys who does that, is that if you do that, you better come into that first date incredibly confident and charming and dazzle her with everything else that you've got. So don't bullshit her to get to meet her and then come in like a wet rag, because then your lie will not only be exposed, it will be the dominant thing about the whole encounter, and she won't listen to another word you say. So is her / their obsession with your height or lack thereof ridiculous? No doubt. Haven't changed on that. But I think the guys who obsess over it, having it, not having it, it's even worse, because you can control every other element of the outcome. And again, you might say, easy for you to say, yeah, maybe, but I own most, not all, of my shortcomings, pun intended, and they are plentiful and they are probably quite obvious. But if you're going to constantly lead with that, if you are her leading with it or if you're him leading with it, the height thing, you're thinking about it if you're her going after it, and you're thinking about it if you're him that you don't quite have it, then nobody's going to get the outcome that you want or deserve. And you don't like me saying all that? You don't like me pointing this out, whether I do against the girls or against the guys on it? I don't know what to tell you other than, who cares really? You knew it was coming back to that. Shoot me an email, greatlovedebate@gmail.com. Give me your height in the subject line, and we'll answer your responses to this, that, and the other. Please, as always, review this podcast. Your reviews after 10 years of doing this podcast, they still mean a lot in the podcasting ecosystem. They might mean even more. Apple has changed their algorithm a little bit, and they really do like the feedback. And the only way they can get some feedback, at least the perception of it, is clicking the stars and giving the reviews. And they matter. Who cares really? I care about that. Because, as always, at The Great Love Debate. We never stop making love. See you next time.